Hello, my name is Yujin Nagasawa. I'm professor of philosophy at the University of Birmingham. I'm really fascinated by the existence and nature of God. That's why I have written many papers and books on various arguments for and against the existence of God. And today I'd like to talk about the ontological argument, which is one of the great arguments for the existence of God. If you look at the philosophical literature, there are many arguments for the existence of God. So, for example, there is the design argument. This argument looks at all sorts of amazing animals and plants in nature. They are all highly sophisticated biological systems. And according to the design argument, it's reasonable to infer the existence of an intelligent designer who created these amazing biological systems. There is also the cosmological argument. So there are many planets and galaxies in our universe, and also our own universe itself began to exist at some point. According to the cosmological argument, there must be the ultimate cause of the universe, which must be very similar to what theists call God, because this ultimate cause must be immaterial, atemporal, and enormously powerful. These arguments are a posteriori arguments, which means that they depend on our empirical observations. So in order to prove the existence of God through these arguments, we need to observe our world. The ontological argument is very unique because this is an a priori argument rather than an a posteriori argument. This means that this argument doesn't depend on any empirical observation. We can just sit down in an armchair and analyze the concept of God to derive the existence of God. So we don't need a telescope or a microscope to prove the existence of God. The ontological argument was introduced by Anselm in the 11th century. So Anselm wrote a book called the Monologion, and in that book he tried to demonstrate the existence of God. But he wasn't really satisfied, and he really wanted to invent a definitive proof of the existence of God. So he wrote, "After I had published the Monologion, I began to wonder if perhaps it might be possible to find one single argument that for its proof required no other save itself, and that by itself would suffice to prove that God really exists, that he is the supreme good needing no other." So Anselm wanted to invent an argument which really demonstrates the very existence of God. And he really struggled, but eventually he came up with an amazing idea, which is the ontological argument. The first premise says that God is that than which no greater is conceivable. This is Anselm's definition of God. So God is the greatest conceivable being. There is no other conceivable being that is greater than God. The second premise says, suppose for the sake of the argument that God does not exist in reality. Then the third premise says, we can then conceive of a being that is greater than God, namely the same being that exists in reality. But this is contradictory. So what Anselm is saying here is that, okay, God is the greatest conceivable being. And if we assume that this being doesn't exist in reality, then we can conceive of a being that is greater than God. But that's contradictory because God is by definition the greatest conceivable being. Anselm says, therefore, our assumption that God as that than which no greater is conceivable does not exist in reality is false. Therefore, God, as that than which no greater is conceivable, exists in reality. Some philosophers like the ontological argument. So, for example, Leibniz said, the ontological argument is very beautiful and really very ingenious. In fact, Leibniz defended a version of the ontological argument. He thought that this is a good argument for the existence of God. But many other philosophers reject the ontological argument. So, for example, Schopenhauer said, "The famous ontological proof is really a charming joke." He thought that the ontological argument is perhaps a clever philosophical trick, but it doesn't prove anything. It definitely doesn't prove the existence of God. We cannot prove the existence of God just by analyzing the concept of God. Kant is another philosopher who rejected the ontological argument. And his most famous objection says that the ontological argument fails because it presupposes that existence is a predicate, which is false, according to Kant. So what is a predicate? When we say Hana is tall, then the phrase is tall represents a predicate. So when we say Hana is tall, we mean that Hana has the property of being tall. Or when we say Matt has a headache, we mean that Matt has the property of having a headache. And the phrase has a headache represents a predicate. What about the claim that God is existent? Here, we cannot say that God has the property of being existent. The phrase is existent doesn't represent the predicate, according to Kant. And also when we say God exists, the phrase exists doesn't represent a predicate, because existence is not a property. When we say Hana is tall, we don't say that Hana is tall and moreover she exists. When we say Hana is tall, then Hana already exists. So existence is not a property or predicate, according to Kant. And he says that the ontological argument fails because it presupposes that that existence is a predicate. Another interesting objection to the ontological argument was introduced by Gaunilo, who was a contemporary of Anselm. Gaunilo says that there is something wrong with the ontological argument, because if we assume that the ontological argument is sound, then we can prove the existence of all sorts of crazy things. So for example, we can prove the existence of the greatest possible island, because the greatest possible island that exists is greater than the greatest possible island that doesn't exist. But of course, the greatest possible island doesn't exist. Therefore, Gaunilo says that there is something wrong with the ontological argument. The modal ontological argument is a contemporary version of the ontological argument. Now, this argument was introduced by some philosophers in the 1960s and 70s. They claimed that Anselm anticipated this argument. The idea behind this argument is as follows. God is a necessary being. We are contingent beings. So people like us and tables and chairs, they are all contingent beings. So they just exist by chance. But God is that than which no greater can be conceived, which means that God is a necessary being. God doesn't exist just by chance or by accident. If God exists at all, then God exists in any possible situation, in any possible world. Now, assuming that God is a necessary being, we can run the modal ontological argument. Suppose that I'm a theist and you are an atheist. And then I ask you, do you think God exists? And you would say, of course not, I'm an atheist. I don't believe that God exists. And now I say, do you believe that it is possible that God exists? And you would probably say, yeah, I'm an atheist, so I don't believe that God actually exists, but it is at least possible, in principle, that God exists. The modal ontological argument says that, okay, now you have granted that the existence of God is at least possible. And now God is meant to be a necessary being. And according to modal logic system S5, if something is possibly necessary, then that means that that's necessary. So you have granted as an atheist that the existence of God as a necessary being is at least possible. But according to this system of logic, this means that you have granted that the existence of God is necessary, which means that God exists necessarily, therefore God exists in reality. So that's the modal ontological argument. And this argument is still disputed among contemporary philosophers. So here is the structure of the modal ontological argument. The first premise says that it is possible that God as a maximally great being and a necessary being exists. The second premise says, if so, it is necessary that God exists. And the conclusion says, therefore, God exists. So the idea is that once you grant the possibility of the existence of God, then you have to accept the necessity of the existence of God, and therefore the actuality of the existence of God. So what is unique about the ontological argument? As I mentioned earlier, there are many arguments for the existence of God, but I like the ontological argument in particular. Firstly, because the ontological argument does not depend on any empirical observation of the world. So unlike the design argument, the cosmological argument, and many other arguments for the existence of God, the ontological argument doesn't depend on any empirical observations. So it doesn't require a telescope or microscope to prove the existence of God. The ontological argument also purports to establish the very existence of God, not the mere intelligent creator or the cause of the universe. The cosmological argument and the design argument, they don't necessarily prove the very existence of God. Because if the design argument is sound, then it proves the existence of an intelligent designer. And if the cosmological argument is sound, then it proves the existence of the ultimate cause of the universe. But we can dispute whether the ultimate cause of the universe or the intelligent designer of nature are really what we call God. And also we can say that the ontological argument is a half step away from a definitive proof of the existence of God, especially when we look at the modal ontological argument. Because if the modal ontological argument is sound, then we don't need to prove the actuality of the existence of God. All we need to do is to prove the possibility of the existence of God. And once we establish that the existence of God is possible, we can plug that in to the modal ontological argument. And it's just a matter of logic that God exists. So that's why I think the ontological argument is very unique, and also it's very attractive.